Buenas tardes en Palo Alto y en Santiago de Chile, Boa noite, Portugal. Welcome to today's lecture, Collective Memories, Postcolonial Ideologies and Present-Day Conflicts, the Mapuche in Chile, by our Luxic visiting scholar, Professor Ana Figueiredo. Thank you, Professor Figueiredo, for joining us today. For those joining us on the live stream, please submit any questions or comments via the YouTube chat section. Kindly note, closed captioning for the live stream video will be provided in the coming weeks. My name is Héctor Hoyos. For those of you who don't know me, I am the faculty director of the Center for Latin American Studies. And it is now my pleasure to let our Latin American Studies MA student, Anis Barron, to introduce our speaker. Anis, pleasure.
Hello, my name is Anis Barron. I'm an MA student in Latin American Studies, and I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker today. Ana Figueiredo is a psychologist who holds a PhD in social psychology from the Universidad de Coimbra, Portugal. She is currently an associate professor at the Universidad de O'Higgins and an associate researcher at the Center for Social Conflict and Cohesion Studies. She is a part of the Observatory of Violence and Social Legitimacy, and recently she finished her three-year term as an elected member of the Governing Council of the International Society of Political Psychology. Ana Figueiredo is a co-editor-in-chief at the Journal of Social and Political Psychology and part of the editorial council of the Journal Analyses of Social Issues and Public Policy. Her main areas of interest are collective memory, ideology, historical conflicts, intergroup relations, citizen-police interactions, violence, and collective action. In this talk, she will present evidence from different studies conducted with self-identified Mapuche participants in Chile regarding how collective memories and post-colonial ideologies are associated with perceptions of conflict and social cohesion in present-day Chilean society. Welcome.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Also for the people seeing us online. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. So thank you, Anis, for the wonderful presentation. The presentation will be in English, but if you want to make any questions in Spanish, Portuguese, please feel free to do so. So, as previously said, I'm going to talk about the Mapuche in Chile, right? And first I want to introduce a little bit of the context and what's been happening in Chile by focusing not only on the present day and the situation in the present day, but also what happened that led to the situation in the present day. So the Mapuche live in what is considered a settler society, right? The continent of the Americas was colonized, and Latin America was colonized by mainly the Portuguese and the Spanish, colonized Chile, in what is now Chile. And when we refer to settler societies, we mean societies where the majority of the population is actually not indigenous to the territory, but is part of the descendants of colonizers that came to the country, and of course with them brought their language, their traditions, their political systems, their religion, and so on. So Mapuche literally means people of the earth, people of the land. And you can imagine that, in terms of cosmovision and spirituality, means they have a very strong connection to their own territory and to their own land. And they're an indigenous people originally from the south of Chile and Argentina, not the extreme south, Patagonia, but kind of the center-south of Chile and Argentina. And at the moment, it is considered that there are approximately 10% of the population in Chile, with a significant increase from the previous census that happened. This is data from the 2017 census that occurred in Chile, which was actually, I don't know how to say it, but then it kind of was declared that it was not valid, and this year there was a new census because there were a lot of mistakes in the questions itself, but also in the way it was implemented. And there's also a lot of controversy about these names because Before, the percentage was way lower of people identifying or self-identifying as Mapuche, and the natality rates are not increasing between the Mapuche people per se, so there is probably an increase in the recognition that people are Mapuche. So we're quite expectant to see what happens now with the results of this new census, because we are expecting that this percentage will increase, and once again, not because the natality rates are increasing, but because people are more willing to declare themselves as Mapuche, something that didn't happen in the past, and this of course is related with processes of historical discrimination. They're mainly present in the capital of the country and in the south of Chile, and mostly in the regions of La Araucanía and Biobío, which is their ancestral territory. There is a misconception that the majority of the Mapuche still live in their ancestral territory, but that's not true. Actually, almost half of the population of the Mapuche population nowadays lives in the capital. Once again, through processes of land dispossession, right? In terms of the history, it's very interesting because the Mapuche were one of the very few indigenous peoples in South America that were able to fight off the Spanish conquest through wars, but also through specific agreements with the Spanish crown that lasted for centuries, as you see, from the 16th to the 19th century. And both these wars, but also specific agreements, the Mapuche were able to maintain a certain degree of territorial autonomy. But when Chile became independent, during the late 19th century, there was a military and civic incursion of this territory in what was called then the pacification of Araucanía, right? And this, of course, carries a quite strong connotation on what it meant to pacify the region. And up until 2017, this was still the expression that was used in textbooks to explain this historical period of the history of Chile. Well, some time goes by, this historical dispossession continues to happen, a lot of the territory is given to new colonizers that are arriving, new settlers that are arriving from Europe after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, but also in between the First and the Second World War. And during the military dictatorship, there is further loss of indigenous rights through distinct laws that discriminated the Mapuche, that didn't acknowledge that they even existed as an indigenous group along other indigenous groups, and a specific law that abolished the collective right to land ownership. That is very important for Mapuche communities. After the transition to democracy in the 90s, there have been specific laws and organizations set up by the state to try and improve the situation of the Mapuche people, but still nowadays there is structural discrimination of the Mapuche, but also other indigenous groups. And still to today, the Mapuche are many times political activists are condemned under the anti-terrorism law that was created during the dictatorship to prosecute opponents of Pinochet, right? So also to show you a bit of the context, when I came to Chile and started doing this project, I wanted to see the intergroup relations between the Mapuche and the majority non-indigenous Chilean population. Because I had this strange idea that the conflict was between these people, right? You know, you have the Mapuche on one side, you have the non-indigenous population, and these are the ones that are not going along, and these are the ones that are kind of fueling the perceptions of conflict and so on. But in 2017, a study with representative sample of Mapuche people that was then kind of mirrored in terms of characteristics with a non-indigenous sample, they were asked, so the samples were asked, thinking of Chile in general, how much conflict do you think there is between the non-indigenous and indigenous people, and this is very interesting that both the Mapuche, the light blue, and the non-Mapuche sample, the darker blue, they actually agree that there's quite or a lot of conflict, right? And this goes into, if you add up these, around 35% with 15, half of the population. And what is most surprising is that there's quite a consensus between the two groups. So who's conflicting with whom, right? That's interesting. But then when you ask them about the conflict between the state and the indigenous people, and in this case, because they asked to different indigenous people, so in this specific item it referred to the Mapuche people, you see that 50% say a lot, and more than 20% say much conflict. So more than 70% of the two populations, or of the two samples, both indigenous and non-indigenous, say there's a lot or a lot of conflict, right? So there is a strong perception of conflict happening, and that the conflict is mainly with the state and a bit less, although it's still 50% of the people saying, with the not between the non-indigenous and the Mapuche population, right? At the same time, at the moment, there is still a lot of repression, and since the previous government from the right-wing Piñera, before the 2021 elections, where Boric, left-wing president, was elected as the next president and took power in 2022, there was the militarization of Araucania, this ancestral territory where a lot of the conflict mostly occurs and where there are mostly violent acts. Some violent acts, yes, are carried out by active resistance Mapuche groups, but some of them have been found to be carried out by other groups that have interests like the forestry economic business, and also hydroelectrical businesses that carry out fake assaults against companies and so on, to blame the Mapuche and somehow increase the levels of repression towards the Mapuche. This area of the country has been under a state of exception for quite some years now. First during the government of Piñera, a right-wing politician, and when this new left-wing government was put in place, there was a hope that the militarization and the state of exception would be taken off, and that hasn't happened until today. Yeah. So military is on the street, the military controls social order. So you can imagine how the situation in the south is, especially considering that police repression is quite high and police violence in Chile is quite high in general. Yeah. There are also cases of montajes, can someone help me with the English word, and coordinated assassinations of Mapuche activists. This is one that happened a few years ago. Matias Catrillanca is a very known Mapuche activist, son of a very known Mapuche activist, and there was a concerted effort. He was assassinated by police forces in the south of Chile, and they tried to make it seem like there was a confrontation. Actually, some politicians even said they saw videos of that confrontation. Those videos don't exist. He was actually shot through the back of his head. It was an execution-style assassination. And just this is one of the very few of the many examples that are occurring in the South with the prosecution of political activists. And then there was the social outburst in 2019 that led to an agreement across the political spectrum in Chile to start a new constituent process, because the constitution in Chile is still the same, even though it had amendments throughout the years, but it's still the same as the constitution of the dictatorship. right? And after the social outburst, there was a constituent process. There have been two, but I want to focus on the first, where through popular vote it was decided that there would be a proposal to make a new constitution, that this constitution, the proposal would be made through elected citizens that would be voted also on the ballot. And one of the people that was voted on was Elisa Loncon. She's a Mapuche linguistic academic, and she was actually voted after the assembly that would write this constitution. She was voted as the president of the assembly, right? So it was very significant that a Mapuche person was the president that for the first time would go into the main effort since the transition to democracy to write this, and you can see her being defined as one of the 100 most important people by Time magazine. Unfortunately, that text was rejected by the majority of the population in Chile, and if you see in Araucanía, this ancestral territory, it actually lost with an 82%, almost 89% of rejection of the new text, which would actually be the first text to recognize indigenous people, because indigenous people are not recognized in the constitution in Chile, and further social and legal rights to indigenous people, of course, among them the Mapuche. And very interestingly, in a survey conducted just days after that, besides being a lot of misinformation and fake news on what was within the constitutional proposal, two sociologists, they haven't published an academic paper on it yet, so I have to quote a journal, like a newspaper that is investigative in nature, that actually, besides the misinformation and fake news and so, one of the things that had the most importance for people who voted no to vote no was the idea of recognizing Chile as a plurinational state with different nations, with different indigenous nations. So that means there was a lot of backlash in terms of the acknowledgement of indigenous rights during this first constitutional process. So now going more into the topic of history, memory, and ideology. People many times make comparisons about the present and the past without sometimes even really thinking about them. So for example, what are people doing here? This is something from the Washington Post. Can anyone tell me what's being done here? Master students, please.
Oh.
Yeah?
They're comparing Trump to Hitler.
A comparison between Trump, a political leader, former leader wanting to be leader again, with Hitler, a historical leader, right? What is being shown in the second one? What is kind of the framing of what is seen here?
Is that Netanyahu and Palestine in the ovens?
In the ovens, and what is here? Arbeit macht frei, right? The slogan of the Auschwitz Holocaust camp, right? And here, for the ones who don't understand Spanish, it says, this is Piñera, the right-wing president during the social outburst, that actually the first thing that he did was to declare the war on the people and to put the military on the streets and declare an obligatory curfew and a state of exception when people came to the streets to protest. And it just says, pillar, the same as Pinochet. So what people do many times, and they do it sometimes without really being aware, in these two cases, I know they are being aware of what they are doing, but they're actually recurring to historical analogies to make sense of present-day events, right? They're anchoring something that is happening in the present that they're trying to explain, and for that they go to the past and draw on examples of the past that are known to many people to make sense of something that is happening in the present to convey a certain message, right? And then we have again three figures, right? What is probably the event that we're talking about here, that these images depict here? What is the main event of the 20th century that probably everyone in the world knows about? Anyone?
World War II.
World War II, right? And what we see here, the Nazis, here,
The Americans.
the Americans, the Allies proclaiming victory, right? And what do we see here? The atomic bomb, right? This is the same historical event. Do you think these three groups, or the ancestors of these, not the ancestors, but the descendants, the descendants of these three groups of people, because we're talking about Germany, the United States, and Japan, who suffered the atomic bomb, the same historical event, do they remember the same historical event the same way? Probably not. That's where collective memory comes, right? So collective memory is not the same as history. And when we talk about collective memory, we should actually be talking about collective memories in plural, because depending on the groups you belong to and the social affiliations you have, your collective memories of the same historical events will be different, right? So collective memories can be defined as a set of shared representations of the past based on a common identity to a group, based on a common belonging to a group, right? So this idea of collective memory holds this position that individuals within certain social groups are agents in the construal of memory. Memory doesn't exist as something static that someone wrote about, like history, right? But that people can construct and even reconstruct through time to make sense of who their group is and who they are as members of the groups. And they are dependent on the cadres sociaux, as Albach would put it, or the frameworks within which a group is situated in society. So collective memories are context dependent, and they connect always past and present. So what I analyze in my research is how specific constructions or reconstructions of the past allow for the maintenance of the status quo or social change. And collective memories have different functions. It's not just to put out certain messages. They define the groups we belong to and their continuity, the never again, right? For example, as a message, so this never happens. They define the rules and values of the group. How does our group behave, no? The Germans leave their past as they leave their negative past and their Nazi past to do something else. They also increase the sense of the group cohesion. They define the relative value of the group in comparison to other groups. They legitimize past, present, and future behavior. Think of make America great again. Again, there's something in the past, right, that we're trying to legitimize and come back to, no certain nostalgia of something there. They mobilize group membership, they mobilize people on collective projects, and they also influence the emotions and feelings that people have. For example, the Portuguese people feel guilty or ashamed for their role in the colonial past and what happened during the colonial period. And this is a proposal by Dario Paez et al., actually a Chilean academic radicated in Spain, But I also propose, and this is the second part of my presentation, that they also serve an ideological function by justifying present-day intergroup conditions and differences and even injustices, right? And here we come to then this ideological function, and ideologies have been defined as an organized set of beliefs and attitudes that can be religious, political, philosophical, that are more or less institutionalized or shared by others, and that derive from external authority. Yeah, usually they come from political, religious elites, and they become quite hegemonic within a given context. And post-colonial ideologies are an articulated set of beliefs and attitudes that seek to maintain the status quo of the post-colonial world order, right, where non-indigenous people have more rights than indigenous groups, and minimize the experiences and demands of indigenous groups. So Sibley and colleagues in New Zealand developed a model of these post-colonial ideologies, what they call the dark duo model of ideologies, and they came up with these two ideologies, historical negation and symbolic exclusion, that would minimize and exclude the Maori within the New Zealand context. Historical negation means the denial, the simple fact that people could deny, for example, the atrocities committed in the past, the killing of Maori people, or minimize the consequences of that past for the present day with this idea, well, okay, bad things were done, but they're not relevant anymore in the present. While symbolic exclusion is this idea that the minority or the indigenous groups, their culture, their language, their customs, are not relevant to the national identity and are not relevant to the nation state and what it means to be a New Zealander, right? And in Chile, I had this sense that there's probably another ideology going on. First, I thought that these will be happening in Chile, but in different ways and with some nuances that are different from the context in New Zealand, because New Zealand has different policies towards the Maori people and so on. And in my project about post-colonial ideologies, I propose miscegenation or mestizaje as a colorblind ideology. You know, this idea that if we're all mixed already, if we're all mestizo, mixed race, then we can deny the existence of different groups, indigenous, non-indigenous, and therefore we can deny rights to these groups in the present day. So, with this in mind, I'm going to bring you now some results of mainly two qualitative studies that I conducted. These studies, study one was conducted through a postdoctoral project funded by the Chilean state. The second one is like an initiation research project also funded by the Chilean state. And I say this because this has consequences in terms of the research that I do, because if they have a conflict with the state and I'm getting paid by the state to do research, well, you can imagine these are the characteristics of my sample, and I want to really make clear that I do research, and when I did these projects, I don't go with a Mapuchometer with me, right? I don't know who is Mapuche or not, and I'm not the one to decide who is Mapuche, because are Mapuche people the ones who have two names, two family names that are Mapuche? Are Mapuche people the ones that live by their values? Are Mapuche people, can we consider Mapuche people who have one family name that is Mapuche and one that is not? So it's very hard then, right? So my first question, and I always interviewed for both of these projects, self-identified Mapuche, non-indigenous Chilean people, and also people that would declare themselves either mestizo or both Mapuche and Chilean. Here I'm just going to focus on people that said, I'm Mapuche, period. Yeah, and this is how they self-identify. It's not how I identify themselves, right? So I did interviews both in Santiago and La Araucanía. The first study was conducted in 2016, and the second study was conducted between October 2021 and January 2022, and part of the first constituent process was occurring while I was doing the field work with my team, and as you see, I finished before the voting of the new constitutional text that was rejected, but Mapuche people still didn't know back then. Interviews were organized through thematic content analysis. There are a lot of issues, of course, of positionality of myself as a Portuguese doing research in Chile with a Mapuche indigenous group, which of course I don't belong to. There are also a lot of ethical and methodological considerations, but that we can discuss later on. At least the master students got the chance to read a little bit about it. But yeah, no going to the results. When I look at collective memories, something that was really striking from the beginning was this. There's a lot of concern with the land, and not the land as an economic resource, right? The land as something that breeds culture, that breeds customs, that breeds cosmovision, that feeds into who the Mapuche are. And I'm asking them about the past. So what do you remember about the past? What did your family tell you about the past? Know your ancestors. What do your grandparents tell you about the past? What do you know about your community? Whether they lived in a community or whether they did not live, they usually know from which community they came from through the family names. No? These communities are called lofs in Mapuzungun, their original language. And something starts happening repetitively, which is, for example, they took our land. That hasn't changed until now. History always treated us, the Mapuche, badly. And something that is always, this sentence is with me, we're better treated in museums than in real life. And then again, the biggest conflict was the loss of territory. That is the struggle. There was a peace treaty with the government, well, the Spanish. When Chile became independent, the Chilean state ripped up that peace agreement. They didn't respect the territory. And intervened, the Chilean state intervened. It intervened with everything it wanted, with religions, with the train, the alcohol, everything. And again, what I think about the request that the Mapuche brothers have, they fight for their lands, that they were colonized. The government would have to comply with them, buy the land and hand it over. And you probably already see something that is happening throughout, no? But we see it here again. Well, a lot of things have been lost. The language, the Guillatunes, which is a very important ceremony where they pay respect to their ancestors and ask for a good prosperous year. Because of capitalism, and as we were talking before with a colleague from Chile, the Chilean state, the conquest, which is in the past, and the usurpation, and once again, until nowadays, they took our land, something that hasn't changed until now. And once again, when I think about the Mapuche, the request that the brothers have, they fight for the land that belongs to them. This one is repeated, that they were colonized. They have to comply, the government has to comply and hand it over, right? And one of the most striking, and that was already kind of signaled through those perceptions of conflict and who the conflict is that there is some cordiality between the Mapuche and the non-indigenous population. But there is a conflict, yes, and the conflict is political. So did you notice anything in these quotes in terms of collective memories, in terms of representations of the past? I'm going to tell you later that. So then we're going to go into what are the post-colonial ideologies that show up. You know, in terms of historical negation, this idea that things didn't happen or that they're not important, what Mapuche says is that, you know, in school there was nothing deep in saying that this or that happened, right? We're not taught. And if they improve the curriculum, this would help benefit us if we knew more about the history. Also, we are not a history textbook on a shelf. This is something we need to continue learning, teaching all the national history related with the indigenous conflict. Also, the Chilean society is not, there is a not missing here, I'm sorry, not necessarily interested in the history of Mapuche people, and also this very interesting criticism that why does it have to be the others who are always speaking, the ones speaking and not us? That will change when they, Chileans, have the willingness to learn, right? And when we go to symbolic exclusion, there comes this idea again that we need to not only teach about what the Mapuche were, because the Mapuche weren't, the Mapuche are. So once again, this idea, they keep excluding us, putting us in the past, and that's not true. Once again, also, that they don't see how indigenous things are in their day-to-day life, and this person, Fernanda, all the names are pseudonyms, that was important to say, no personal information of the people is here, that says, I identify you with a song that says that deep down they are all liars. They, the Chileans, of course. There is blood spilled, there is no justice, so don't expect roses. The concept of resistance stemming from anger, from exclusion. And then also our language, that today our people do not know their first language. I think this is something said. So there's always this idea of being excluded, of having something that was lost. And then it's also interesting how self-identified Mapuche people can also consider the idea of being mestizos, or at least attributing ideas of mestizaje to the Chileans. Yeah, because there's this continued separation, but actually they have our blood. As we can see there, the Chilean culture is a culture of mestizos. The Mapuche culture and the Chilean culture are very linked, because obviously the Chilean culture was born from a mixture between the Spaniards and the Mapuche. Or once again, we are also part of the Mapuche people, but we also feel Chilean. We feel Chilean in terms of the territory in which we live. Or once again, we are all mestizos, but we identify ourselves by the way we live in terms of adhering to the cultural and to the Mapuche customs. And this last person that says that, I think that people consider themselves that way because they consider themselves Mapuche and Chilean because we don't have a choice, right? Within Chile, we have a Chilean ID card. But it's also very interesting, this positionality, that it's the Chilean culture that is mestizo. We're still Mapuche, right? But they claim to be Chilean, but they are mestizo, especially how these two first people see it, which is very interesting, attributing mestizaje to the others but not to themselves. And what we also find is that somehow other ideologies seem to appear when we have labeled that material exclusion in terms of the loss of language, which is not just a way of communicating, but also of being able to express who you are through your own language. So my mother spoke, my father spoke, but they did not want to teach us Mapuzugun. So they always spoke to us in Spanish. In the previous project, I also have a lot of data that shows this. And when you ask them why, they said, because my parents didn't want me to be discriminated. So they rather have us only speaking Spanish and not Mapuzungun, so they wouldn't discriminate me. Also at schools, Mapuche children were forbidden from speaking Mapuzungun. So this is also processes of discrimination, of forbidding their culture to be expressed within the construction of the Chilean state and the Chilean structure, no, through education, through church, etc. So once again also comes the issue of land ownership and the way that the Chileans see it as a commercial good, which for the Mapuche it is not. The land is not an economic gain, no? The person sees in the Wallmapu. The Wallmapu is the way they refer to the La Araucanía, their ancestral territory. The Wallmapu as a market, as a material. But for the Mapuche, not only material, it's also spiritual. As merchandise, one could say the issue was the land, and from there also as an economic good with economic gains. But on the other hand, not for the Mapuche. Therefore, Chilean society, there comes all this stereotype that the Mapuche, because they don't work the land for economical gain, they do not take advantage. So there comes the stereotype as the lazy, that they do not take advantage of their land and that they have abandoned the land. While for the Mapuche, they see it the other way around. They see it as protecting the land of the extractivist model. And again, this idea that, you know, if you've lost pieces of your territory, for example, if your cemetery is where there is now a farm, they are changing how you define yourself as a person, how you are going to have that freedom of worship, how you are going to interact with yourself and your ancestor. Right? So in a way, it's not just an exclusion at the symbolic level, but also material spaces. And we think that language is both at the symbolic, but also material level of being able to express, and of course the territory as being the environment in which this material expression can come out. Because, for example, many communities nowadays refuse, and they refuse themselves to carry out their own ceremonies in land that is not the land that they lost, because it's not the sacred land that their ancestors defined as the right place to do the ceremony. So they rather not continue doing their ceremonies than doing them in a space that is not supposed. So that's also a material way of breaking the chains of cultural transmission with the new generations. So we also think that this material aspect is very important, even though it's very hard to articulate with the others, right? So, and then comes the reparation and recognition demands. If you see, if they would teach, things would change. No, but and we want the land back, but the earth is dying. There's an error that must be repaired. So people are aware that there's something that needs to be repaired, that needs to be recovered, and there needs to be some kind of organization that talks about reparation, but then they have many criticism about this and the way reparation is being interpreted by the state, in the sense that programs come already designed, they are made like, they come made like we do, and we have nothing to say, so they're not participatory, and no one understands the Mapuche ideology, so they just put on us what they think is good for us, and that's not good, and the state abandoned us completely. When they talk about recognition, it's even worse, because they feel recognition doesn't really exist. So even though they already recognize the Mapuche people, and at least we have the constituent president, Elisa Loncon, as a representative to write, beyond recognizing, I hope they stop bothering us. They stop intervening Mapuche places and leave them free. So it's not only recognizing and saying, yes, there is a Mapuche woman, no, like a species, some kind of tokenism, but really recognize, and also talk about Mapuche political rights and cultural rights that would allow for the right of self-determination and associated public policies. And once again, there's a lot of criticism to this recognition by the state. And it's very interesting, this one, because it says, I am not interested in the recognition that a third party can make of the situation. Recognizing our culture is a euphemism used to appropriate other people's customs and turn them into a product that can be sold to tourists, right? Or this one, for example, that it has to be written on a piece of paper where it says the state recognizes the Mapuche people. But what? In what? How is this going to be evidence? How is this recognition going to be carried out? So they are aware that something needs to be done. They need this reparation, they need this demand, because it's not only about reparating the past, but recognizing the rights, and this doesn't mean exactly the same, because you can recognize the Mapuche people without acknowledging the past, and you can repair the past without recognizing their rights in the present. You can give them back their land, but not give them political rights, right? And this is quite different, so both of them are needed. So, in terms of final reflections, and I want to come back to the collective memories that I showed you, and now I'm going to say what you probably saw and were afraid to say, or maybe you didn't notice, was that they always speak, and they start speaking in the past. There was, they did, it happened, and in the same sentence comes the present. That was the struggle. That is still the struggle. They took our land. We still don't have our land. And if you see, all of the examples I gave you have the exact same thing happening over and over again, which is something that had never occurred in my research in other contexts where I analyzed collective memories. Yeah, I analyzed, for example, collective memories of Congolese migrants living in Belgium about the colonization of Congo by Belgium, and you know, those things happened. And even though we live in a post-colonial world and the consequences of colonialism are still there for the Congolese people, they said during the colonial period this happened. No, now something else is happening because there is a different structure. There was an independence of Congo. Here there's no independence. The territory is the same, and the same things are still happening. The same dispossession. They are still losing territory for forestry and hydroelectric projects. So the continuity between the past and the present is really striking. The collective memories are part of a foregone past, but also part of the present-day continued struggle of the Mapuche. So the narrative construction as well of this extreme connection between past and present, where they actually don't really make the difference, the verbs are there and the verbs themselves are always connecting this, is the continued loss of territory and identity and culture of the time. And the main responsible for this is the Chilean state, without forgetting the role of the church as an important actor in cultural loss, because they start being evangelized, so they stop doing their ceremonies and so on, once they start believing, and this is very important in the present day with new evangelical churches. For example, I interviewed a Longo, which is the main authority of a Mapuche community, Lof, who was evangelical, and he doesn't go to the ceremonies of his own community, and he's the main authority of his community, and that is very strong, right? And also education as an important factor in reducing stereotypes and harm to Mapuche people. And then when we look at the postcolonial ideologies, is that we see a vicious circle through which symbolic and material exclusion and historical negation happen, but then the recognition and reparation policies, when the state actually does them, they are not contextualized, they are not culturally sensitive, and they do not consider the Mapuche cosmovision or perspective, so the Mapuche are not included in them, which then reinforces its own historical, the historical negation and the symbolic exclusion and the material exclusion. So they keep feeding into each other, the way the state is doing things, right? So it's very important to consider, especially this. Mainstream media continues to portray the Mapuche in a negative way, mostly focused on this idea of terrorism and terrorist acts. And as I said, there are a lot of made-up accusations against Mapuche people. There are a lot of Mapuche activists that are currently in jail, and they spend sometimes months, sometimes years there, and then in the end there is no guilty verdict. There's fabricated evidence, there are assassinations of political activists, Mapuche. The elites are mainly focused on different priorities, and while the left-wing government now in place said they wanted to improve the relations with the Mapuche and bring forth better policies and programs, their priorities are now in completely different places, in crime, delinquency, and migration, which is now kind of what is under the discussion. And of course, after the first constituent proposal was denying, there seemed to be no promising venues for resolving the conflict between the Mapuche and the Chilean state, and there seems to be no way for recognition to happen in the short or the mid run, right? So this is for Mapuche people, but also for other indigenous groups. The thing is that for the Mapuche is more evident because there is the levels of conflict and the violence of the conflict is much higher. So the official recognition for constitutional rights seems like an impossible dream to achieve at the moment, and I think for quite a long time. So acknowledgements to all of my research team, of course, to all the participants. We spent with them, interviews ranged from half an hour to some of them with 4 hours talking with these people. Most of them receiving us at home, giving us food, because that's the way the Mapuche do the things, giving us a lot of mate to drink, a lot of food they do themselves, the jams, the honey, everything. And of course, I want to thank the opportunity of being here. Thank everyone at class for receiving me, for allowing me this opportunity, the Luxic Foundation, and of course all the funding agencies that have allowed me to do this work.
Anna, would you like to field questions yourself, or would you like me to moderate?
As you prefer. I can see everyone, so maybe I can take
And you're
questions.
welcome to take several questions at a time, or one
Okay.
at a time, as you prefer.
I'll grab my note.
Prioritizing master students at first, though. Ha!
Okay, maybe Jimena, Hector, and I forgot your name, I'm sorry. Sorry, there's first semester students. So
Okay.
Thank you so much for the presentation today. So I have a question about the methodology, because in the 2020 material it said that you have encountered cases where people think that may not be Mapuche enough to do the research, and that in the qualitative method you mentioned that you mainly did interviews with people who self-identify as Mapuche. And I was wondering, how often would that occur in during your questionnaire collecting process?
So yeah, that's true. As I said, I never took the Mapuchometer with me, and so I let people say, how do you identify? And the second question that I had, and there's a paper that I've been wanting to do for so long, and also with combining the data of the two studies, because I asked them, you know, people identify in different ways, you know, and as part of different social groups. How would you say that you identify? And just to give you a very interesting example, I had one person, a young woman, that said, first I'm a feminist and then I'm a Mapuche. You know, and I wasn't talking about feminism or anything. I was talking about Mapuche, mestizo, or dual identity, both Chilean and Mapuche, which is something that people actually then explain is different, you know, because one is integrated and the other is not. It's like living with two identities. And for some people, and that for me was also a surprise because I didn't expect it in the beginning, and then I was like, you should have expected this, because some people said, well, I am Mapuche and I am also Chilean because I live within Chile, you know. Chileans are always around me, so of course I also have things in me that are Chilean, and these people I identify them as different and I didn't include them here. Usually we would have, I don't know, I had 28, and actually I had 28 self-identified Mapuche in each study, and it wasn't on purpose. It's not like a golden number I wanted. It's just what happens, because I go there and then I had Mapuche people living inside communities that would say, I identify as Chilean. And then I would analyze their interviews as part of the Chilean group. And people would say, I identify as both Chilean and Mapuche, and I put them in that group, right? But I would say, I don't know, out of 10 people, maybe 2 would say they would feel that they're mixed or mestizo or have double identity. But none of them are here in these results. Thank you.
Raise your hand.
Thank you, Anna, for the amazing presentation. I want to ask about something that happens with Mapuche people, is that they really do not belong into one country only in Latin America, right? Like the Mapuche people exist in the territories that are shared by Argentina and Chile. And so I was wondering if there is a side in your research that also thinks about this in 2 ways. One is in this recognition that belonging to the Mapuche is different than belonging to Chile or Argentina, in terms of, you know, like the memories of families that may exist in between the two. And also with regards to one possibility of state inclusion of an identity that is not exclusive to the territory that state administers, right? Because I think that in your presentation you alluded to the fact that in terms of, you know, like the trauma of the Mapuche, like the repetition of the Spanish intervention through the independence, is that the independence further, atomizes Mapuche life because it separates it into 2 territories that are supposed to be by sovereignty administered by 2 different states. So how would an inclusion in terms of the constitutions of the 2 countries could include a collective that exists through the 2 territories at the same time?
Thank you. I'm going to take the other 3 questions and then answer the
thank you, Anna, for your presentation, amazing presentation. It's quite funny to be in Stanford speaking in English about it's crazy, right? But this is the effect of the globalization, right? And also, I'm a Mapuche also, and your presentations, I saw my bloodline in the meantime you were talking. So, but one of the things that I'm wondering, and I would like to know, it's using my assumptions and my theoretical framework, it seems that there is a problem and a past and now problem. So one of the things I would like to ask to you, or maybe challenge to you, is what would be the next? Because as you are extremely well explained, the loopings on history and present time, but what would be the next? Because it seems that we have a gap in Chile that Mapuche culture cannot bring the future in present time. And this is an extraordinary problem. And actually, thank you, because you triggers actually, and it really intrigues me, because most part of the attention and the focus on research is in past and present. But what's happened with the next? And why I'm asking to you this? We know very well that, for example, democracy around the world is falling down. We are living the polarization. But also, I could say that I could feel, actually, because I'm driving my feelings now, when I listen carefully, we know very well that our past, but there is no recognition of colonization legacy in the Chilean culture. So this is at one point. If we don't acknowledge our colonies, our colonial actually impact, for sure, through the neoliberal state that Pinochet has established 40 years ago, we have another issue, because it seems that we are living a bunch of accelerators, but the acceleration, it doesn't mean you will see a direction to the future. So one of the things that triggered me is what would be the future from the Mapuche people, because it's all about the past. Of course, if we don't face and overcome, you cannot fight against colonialism. You need to overcome it. So I would like to know the future to overcome with my fellow Mapuches, with my pennies. How to overcome it. And thank you for the presentation. It's an amazing one.
Well, congratulations for your presentation. It was quite interesting. I have one question about your presentation. Is about the political representation of the Mapuche people, because for some time it seems that let me frame it another way. Like, who represents the Mapuche people? Like in this case, because in your presentation we're constantly talking about the state and the Mapuche, but the Mapuche are actually fragmented, right? I don't know, a collective, a political community are more about different families and groups. Some of them are benefited from the states, others might not, as you mentioned. So that is an interesting question that I would like you to dig a little bit more. And specifically, and just to challenge you a bit more, right? And why do you think that in the south of Chile, in the Araucanía, where there are more Mapuche communities, the right wing wins more than in the rest of the country? So how can we see, like, what can you say about that or reflect about that?
Thank you. Fabiola?
Yeah, I was wondering if there have been instances in which the Mapuche people have collaborated with other indigenous groups in Chile to advance, to fight for the rights. And if that has been the case, I'm wondering how often does that normally take place?
Thank you. Okay, so first, Jimena, thank you for the question. I think that's a very interesting and also very, I don't know how to put it, but it's an interesting question, and at the same time very not demanding, but I find it very difficult to put the two states in agreement on how you acknowledge the situation. Also, because in Argentina the situation is a bit different, even though there is conflict with the Mapuche, even though they're like, I don't know, some years ago there was a Mapuche activist that also disappeared in very strange situations. It was also probably a targeted assassination. There is prosecution, there is police repression against Mapuche activists, but somehow it's hidden within Argentinian society. For example, it doesn't show up as much in the media in Argentina as it does in Chile, so it's less kind of, portrayed as something like of a really big problem. But in terms of, how to gather this collective or not, I think that would be really important, especially for indigenous communities or Mapuche communities living closer to the Argentinian border or living more close to the Andes. And this is also very important, and you touched on something that I didn't mention, but is important to mention, that the Mapuche are not a homogeneous group at all. There are many types of Mapuche. You have the Huilliche, the Pehuenche, the Lafkenche, and these are all different types of identities that are also very much related with the territory. So if you are closer to the coast, you belong to a different group of Mapuche, and your customs or traditions are also very associated with the sea and the fauna and the flora that is close to the sea. But if you live closer to the mountains, there's already another subgroup of Mapuche that has different worldviews and a different relation again with the flora and the fauna because of that. So this is not an homogeneous group. Also, there is not one authority for the Mapuche. That's actually also probably the reason why they were always able, for example, to really fight with the Spanish, because you didn't have like one warrior king or so, but they worked in kind of cells in the lofts, right? And so because you didn't have one person that you killed and kind of dismembered an army of warriors or so, they were able to really be creative in the way of defending themselves. I think that is interesting, and I know there is a lot of connections between the Mapuche activist groups between both sides. I wouldn't know how the two countries would be willing to, for example, both of them jointly recognize plurinationality. But it is true that after the independence, because before the independence, many of the Mapuche groups were nomads. So they actually crossed the Andes and they lived between Argentina and Chile, depending on the time of year, and that of course stopped with border control and so on. I think it would be a very interesting challenge, and I haven't seen if Mapuche activism has put any idea forward in terms of that, in terms of looking at the ancestral, well, they do look at the ancestral territory as being one, and ignoring the border between Chile and Argentina, and they do see it as such, but I don't know if there are any actual proposals of, coming back to that original territory. From what I know in Chile, it's mostly about recovering the Wallmapu, which is the part of La Araucanía and part of the Biobío, and not mentioning the part that is now Argentina. But I find it very interesting about talking about this new identity, a more like supra identity that combines both, and of course the solidarity and the joint activism is already there, so it's a possibility in the future, definitely. So yeah, thank you. I think it's a challenging question to answer, but it's thought-provoking to think through in future projects, also to ask people what are their opinion about this. So what is the future? I think I don't have an answer for that because I like to study the past. No, I'm not gonna shy away so easily. What would be the future? I mean, very honestly, I think that until the state and not a government, right, really implements a very solid and concrete steps to deal with the situation of the Mapuche, but also the other indigenous groups in Chile in a program that might take 10, 15, 20 years, and that is a program exactly with short-term, mid-term, long-term goals to really address the root causes of this issue, address the economic interests of this issue, the political actors, and start including the different Mapuche factions and ways of seeing the future into this, because as the colleague next to you said, there's not one Mapuche way of looking into this. There's not one Mapuche representative. There's not even one Mapuche political party. I mean, they tried to have one and they couldn't agree on what they wanted, right? So if there's not a government that kickstarts a state policy and a program with concrete steps towards that, the future for me is very grim. But I do have hope, and I'm starting to see some changes with these new young generations, and especially this first generation of Mapuche people going into university, becoming academics. That has brought a significant cultural and political shift into the discussion, both at the academic level but also at the political level. The Mapuche Association of Historians has done brilliant work in terms of revisiting the history of Chile and saying, hey, the history is told by the eyes of the winner, and there's many things that haven't been told, and now there's more and more people coming, for example, in terms of law and reinterpreting the law and really putting the law at the service of Mapuche communities. That's also very important. And I think that both at the academic and political level, things will change when we start having more Mapuche participation, because as just one of the participants said, while the others are talking for us, and I include myself in that group, and it's not us talking, we're still going to have a big problem. We're still the other. We're still being othered, right? And that is completely true. The way the situation is now, and in the short run, I see a dark future, especially with the polarization, with the growth of the extreme right wing, with extreme right-wing groups in the south like Capra, and a lot of setups that are occurring and so on, and of course the economic interests. But I think there could be steps. I mean, you've had one report for acknowledging the wrongdoings of the past, but it's a book this big. I'm probably one of the 100 people that has it, and it's so big you cannot take it out of the home because it's so heavy. But it was done, and it was shelved in the National Library, and no other government took the findings to say, okay, what can we do now to correct this? So that could be a starting point. For example, if actually any government now knows that it exists, because I think they don't even know that it exists. In terms of the political representation of the Mapuche, as I said, it's a very heterogeneous group. It's very difficult to find a common ground. Like, even many Mapuche people are against the idea of territorial autonomy, are against the idea of the definition of a plurinational state. They want territory back, they want more cultural and political rights, but they don't go as far as plurinationality, as territorial autonomy, as including law, civil law autonomy. That was something also proposed in the first constitutional text. And that's also striking for me because, especially in La Araucanía historically has always been a right-wing region. And people would ask me, why is that region always so right-wing? And before the vote was compulsory, because before the vote was compulsory, then it became voluntary in 2013. And my study started afterwards, so people would ask me, why is it always the right wing in La Araucanía? And I would say, because the Mapuche are disaffected and they're not voting. But for the constitution, the vote became obligatory, and since then, all elections are obligatory. Just this Sunday, there are local elections for municipalities, governors, regional governors, and so on, and now the vote is obligatory. And you saw that almost 89% of the people in that region rejected. The abstention rates weren't different from many regions, so the Mapuche were voting, and the Mapuche were rejecting a constitution that would give them more rights than anything else that has ever happened in the country. Why? I don't know. I think there's fear of change. I think there's fear of the backlash that could come from the elites and the non-indigenous population. Because if you remember, during the campaign for the constitution, the vote of the constitution, there was this idea that now the Mapuche will have more rights and they will be first-class citizens and we will be second-class citizens, and they will take our houses, and the poor Mapuche agricultural, the poor non-indigenous farmer is going to lose the house to the Mapuche farmer, who already has more rights because he's Mapuche and he's getting subsidies from the state. But it's still really hard to understand why. Yeah, and for me it was also a shock to see those, because then before you could say they're not voting, but now they're voting and they're saying they don't want this. So I don't know what to say, and of course there is not a single political representation. There will never be. And I must also say that of course I have a huge problem or limitation. I don't consider it a problem, it's just the way it is. I have a huge limitation in terms of the self-selection of my participants. Even right-wing Mapuche participants won't be interviewed, and more radical activists who are willing to resist through violence and other means, they also won't talk with me. The same way as right-wing landowners in the south won't talk to me. So there's a huge problem with self-selection. I'm getting kind of the moderate views on the conflict, and this is what it is, and this is where I get to go, and there's nothing I can do about it. So yeah, there's something going on there. I actually, after those elections, I thought I'm never going to study the Mapuche again, because I cannot understand, because it doesn't make sense with what I'm showing here. Right? It doesn't, the discourses are too different with the votes that we then see. So it's very hard. And the collaboration with other indigenous groups, yes, it occurs. It occurs, for example, for the constitutional process, there were very few because they had reserved seats. And of course, a lot of the proposals, they worked together with other indigenous groups, but it's very important to be clear that 80% of the indigenous population is Mapuche, and then only 20% of the remaining indigenous population is other indigenous groups. So the Mapuche population is the biggest Mapuche group by large, saying that 2 out of 10 indigenous peoples belong to one of 8 other indigenous groups in Chile. So as you can imagine, there's way more focus and strength on the position of Mapuche and political demands of other Mapuche than the others, and somehow those collaborations, even though they happen, For the Mapuche, they're sometimes not so necessary because they're the biggest group. I mean, 80% of the population, of the indigenous population. No, and of course in the north, specifically the Aymara, they're dealing with other issues like the mining industry, the loss of natural resources, mainly water, and the pollution of their soil and the water that is causing a lot of diseases and so on. So it's a bit different. But yes, they do collaborate in certain instances, and especially in certain political demands, definitely.
I'm standing up just because part of my duties is to adjourn, and I did have a question, but instead, why don't I repurpose it as a comment, as a way of thanking you truly for this amazing talk. For several in the room, there's the methodological question, right? How do you go about deploying a method, finding a method? And one thing I notice here is that there's a combination of the qualitative and the quantitative. And note that given the nature of the problem at hand, the quantitative alone could not do the work. This is something I want to emphasize, because you have to engage with narratives to contend with something like contested memories. I mean, how could you do it without the narrative? How could you do it without the qualitative? So I just want to emphasize that for those in the room who are finding their footing as MA students in Latin American Studies, an interdisciplinary program, or as PhD students, say, in sociology or anthropology or literature, right? Interdisciplinary in other ways. I'm thinking, with my bias as a literary scholar, there is a very rich tradition of poetry in Chile, and in the Araucanía in particular. There is Mapudungun poetry, there is poetry, of course, in Spanish, there is poetry in German. There is a book by Gloria Dunkler called Fuchse von Jafenko, written in German. Why? Because you have all of the German immigrants in Chile. So all this to say, if you are doing a literary study, well, then you would have to engage with this scare quotes context, or actually working with literature, also veering away from the philological to actually understand what the literature means. Because imagine if you were just studying Mapudungun poetry as poetry, you wouldn't get at the poetry. So sorry to get overly excited about this important topic and this amazing talk, but I wanted to share that comment. Because we still have cheese and crackers and other goodness out there, I'll proceed to adjourn. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to Professor Figueiredo.
Thank you.
Announcements. On November 7th, 2024 at 4:30 p.m., the Cuba Observatory will be hosting Covering Socialist Cuba, the Challenges and Rewards of Doing Alternative Journalism on a Country the U.S. Targets for Regime Change, with two prominent Havana, Cuba-based journalists, Liz Olivia Fernandez